The smell of fresh coffee and bacon grease still clung to the kitchen air when I found the envelope slipped under my apartment door that Tuesday morning. My name was written across the front in James Patterson's careful lawyer handwriting, the kind that immediately makes your stomach drop because you know whatever's inside is going to change everything. I was running late for a client meeting in Ames, rushing around my Des Moines apartment trying to find my soil analysis reports, when I nearly stepped right on it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I should have waited. Should have taken it to work and opened it during lunch, maybe prepared myself for whatever legal document was waiting inside. Instead, I tore it open right there in my hallway, still holding my travel mug and laptop bag, and read the words that would flip my entire world upside down. Dear Sarah, per the last will and testament of Franklin James Mitchell, you are hereby notified that you have inherited Sunset Ridge Farm in its entirety, including all buildings, equipment, livestock, and 180 acres of prime agricultural land in Millbrook County. The letter went on, but I stopped reading after in its entirety. My legs went weak, and I had to lean against the wall to keep from dropping everything in my hands. Uncle Frank had been gone for 3 weeks now, and while his death from a sudden heart attack had devastated me, I never imagined he'd leave me anything more than maybe his old pocket watch or his collection of seed catalogs. The farm was supposed to go to Tyler, my cousin. Everyone in the family had been saying so for years. I drove to Sunset Ridge Farm that afternoon, instead of going to my client meeting, calling in sick for the first time in 2 years. The gravel driveway crunched under my tires as I pulled up to the farmhouse, and for a moment I just sat in my car, staring at the place that had shaped more of my childhood than my actual home ever did. The white clapboard siding needed a fresh coat of paint, and the front porch still sagged slightly on the left side where Frank always said he'd get around to fixing it someday. The red barn stood proud and sturdy behind the house, its metal roof gleaming in the afternoon sun, and beyond that stretched row after row of corn, now brown and ready for harvest. This was where I'd spent every summer from age 8 to 18, learning to drive the old John Deere tractor before I was legally old enough to drive a car. Frank had taught me to read soil composition by touch, to know when corn was ready by the sound the stalks made in the wind, and to fix a broken irrigation line with nothing but duct tape and determination. While other kids my age were at summer camps or sleeping until noon, I was up at dawn helping with the morning chores, and I loved every single minute of it. Miguel Rodriguez was coming out of the equipment shed when he spotted my car. He'd been Frank's right-hand man for 15 years, and seeing his weathered face break into a smile made something tight in my chest finally loosen. He walked over with that careful, measured gait of someone who'd spent decades working the land, wiping his hands on an old rag. "Miss Sarah," he said, tipping his baseball cap, "heard you might be coming by. Mr. Frank, he always said you'd be back to take care of this place properly." That stopped me cold. "He said that?" Miguel nodded, his dark eyes serious. "Last few months especially. He'd stand out there in the corn rows and say, 'Sarah understands what this land needs. She's got the education and the heart for it.' Said you were the only one in the family who ever asked him about crop rotation instead of just how much money the farm was worth." We walked through the property together, Miguel pointing out the improvements Frank had made over the past year. New irrigation system, upgraded grain storage, fresh coat of sealant on the barn roof. The place was in better shape than I'd ever seen it, clearly primed for a successful operation. The numbers running through my head were staggering. 180 acres of prime Iowa farmland, currently planted in corn and soybeans, with soil quality that would make any agricultural consultant weep with joy. Conservative estimates put the land value alone at over $2 million, not counting the equipment, buildings, or the potential income from crops. "Your cousin Tyler stopped by yesterday," Miguel mentioned casually as we examined the combine harvester. "Seemed real surprised when I told him about the will. Said he'd be in touch about the harvest." My stomach clenched. I'd been so overwhelmed by the inheritance itself that I hadn't even thought about how the rest of the family would react. Tyler had been telling people for years that he'd take over the farm someday, despite the fact that his longest job had been 6 months at a hardware store, and he'd never shown the slightest interest in agriculture. But he was the son in the family, and in a place like Millbrook County, that still carried weight with some people. I drove back to Des Moines that evening with my head spinning and my phone buzzing constantly with missed calls. I turned it off after the third call from my mother, Linda, because I wasn't ready for whatever conversation was coming. The inheritance felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in movies, not to crop consultants who lived in studio apartments and drove 10-year-old Honda Civics. That night I finally listened to the voicemails. The first was from my mother, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk about this situation with Frank's farm. There's been some kind of mistake with the will, and we need to get it sorted out before things get complicated." The second was from my father, Robert, Frank's younger brother. His tone was different, more direct. "Sarah, call me back. We need to discuss the farm situation as a family. Tyler's been counting on this inheritance, and there are things you don't understand about Frank's financial situation." The third voicemail made my blood run cold. It was from my Aunt Carol, Tyler's mother, and her voice dripped with the kind of sweet venom that only family members can perfect. "Sarah, sweetheart, I'm sure you know this farm inheritance is just Frank's way of making a point about hard work. Of course you'll do the right thing, and make sure Tyler gets what's rightfully his. After all, you have your career in the city. You don't need a farm you can't even manage." I deleted the messages and poured myself a glass of wine, trying to process what I'd just heard. They weren't calling to congratulate me or express condolences about Frank's death. They were calling to tell me I didn't deserve what he'd left me, and that I should hand it over to Tyler without question. The assumption that I'd just roll over and give up the inheritance made my jaw clench with anger I didn't know I was capable of feeling. The next morning brought a text from Tyler himself, casual and confident in a way that made my skin crawl. "Hey, cuz, heard about the crazy will situation. Don't worry, we'll get it sorted out quick so you don't have to deal with all that farm stress. Maybe we can grab coffee and figure out the easiest way to transfer everything over." I stared at that message for a full 5 minutes, reading it over and over. The entitlement was breathtaking. He wasn't asking or suggesting. He was informing me that the transfer would happen as if my opinion was just a minor detail to work around. I thought about all the summers I'd spent learning Frank's business while Tyler was in town playing video games or hanging out at the mall. I thought about the countless conversations Frank and I had shared about sustainable farming practices, soil conservation, and the future of agriculture in Iowa. I thought about how Tyler had shown up to exactly 3 family gatherings at the farm in the past 10 years, and each time he'd spent the entire visit complaining about the smell and asking when Frank was going to install better Wi-Fi. Instead of responding to Tyler's text, I called James Patterson, Frank's lawyer. He was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who'd been handling legal affairs for farming families in Millbrook County for decades. When I explained the family's reaction to the will, he was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah," he finally said, "your uncle spent a lot of time thinking about this decision. He came to see me 6 months ago with a very specific plan. He said he'd watched you grow up on that farm, watched you study agriculture in college, and watched you build a career helping other farmers improve their operations. He said Tyler was a good kid but had never shown real interest in farming, and that the land deserved someone who would honor what it could become." Patterson went on to explain that the will was ironclad, drafted carefully to prevent any legal challenges. Frank had been of completely sound mind when he'd signed it, with multiple witnesses present. The inheritance was mine, legally and morally, no matter what my family thought about it. But legal ownership and family peace were 2 very different things, as I was about to discover. The confrontation came that weekend. I'd driven out to the farm on Saturday morning to meet with Miguel about the upcoming harvest, trying to understand the scope of what I'd inherited and what decisions needed to be made immediately. The corn was ready, and we had maybe 2 weeks of good weather to get it all in before the first frost. I was standing in the equipment shed, marveling at the well-maintained machinery Frank had left behind, when I heard car doors slamming in the driveway. Through the shed's open door, I watched my parents' silver SUV pull up next to my car, followed immediately by Aunt Carol's white sedan. Tyler climbed out of the passenger seat of his mother's car, and for a moment the 4 of them stood in the driveway like they were planning a military operation. My mother was holding a manila folder, my father had his phone pressed to his ear, and Carol was gesturing emphatically while Tyler nodded along. I took a deep breath and walked out to meet them, trying to project more confidence than I felt. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the earthy smell of harvest season, and for a moment I felt Frank's presence so strongly it was like he was standing right beside me. "Sarah," my mother said, her smile bright and artificial. "We came out to see the old place and talk through this whole situation." "What situation is that?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. My father stepped forward, tucking his phone into his jacket pocket. "The will situation, obviously." Frank wasn't thinking clearly these past few months. His doctor said the heart medication could cause confusion, and obviously he made some decisions that don't make sense for the family. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Frank was perfectly clear when I talked to him 3 weeks ago. He knew exactly what he was doing. "Sarah, honey," Aunt Carol said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you're a smart girl, but you don't understand farming economics. This place needs full-time attention, and you have a career in the city. Tyler's been preparing for this responsibility his whole life." I almost laughed at that. Preparing how? He's never worked a harvest, never maintained equipment, never dealt with crop insurance or commodity markets. I've been doing agricultural consulting for 5 years. I understand farming economics better than anyone in this family, except Frank. Tyler finally spoke up, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. "Look, Sarah, we all know Frank had a soft spot for you because you spent summers here as a kid. But this is about what makes sense for the family business. I'm the one who's going to carry on the Mitchell name, and I'm the one who's been planning to take this over." "Planning to take it over while doing what exactly?" I shot back. "Living in your mother's basement and working part-time at GameStop?" The temperature in the conversation dropped about 20 degrees. Carol's face flushed red, and my father stepped between us like he was breaking up a playground fight. "That's enough," he said firmly. "We're family, and we need to work this out like adults. Frank's gone, and we can't ask him what he really intended. But common sense says the farm should go to the person who can actually run it, and Tyler's the one who's available to be here full-time." "I can run it," I said quietly. "I've been thinking about nothing else for the past 3 days. I can take a leave of absence from my consulting job, or even work remotely for some clients while I focus on the farm. This is exactly the kind of operation I've been helping other people build for years." My mother opened the manila folder she'd been carrying and pulled out a stack of papers. "Sarah, we've already talked to a realtor about putting the place on the market. Jennifer Walsh thinks we can get at least $2.1 million, maybe more if we wait for spring. Split 4 ways between you, Tyler, your father, and me. That's over $500,000 each. You could pay off your student loans, buy a nice house in Des Moines, maybe even start your own consulting firm." The audacity of it took my breath away. She was standing on the land Frank had left specifically to me, talking about selling it and dividing the proceeds like I was just another stakeholder in some business deal. Like my inheritance was community property that she had a right to redistribute according to her own sense of fairness. "You want to sell Frank's farm?" I said slowly, making sure I understood correctly. "The farm he loved more than anything in the world, the farm he spent 40 years building into something profitable and sustainable. You want to turn it into a housing development or strip mall so everyone can get a check." "It's the practical thing to do," my father said. "None of us are farmers, Sarah. Even you aren't really a farmer. You're a consultant. This land is worth too much money to just let it sit here." "It's not sitting here," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "It's producing crops. It's generating income. It's doing exactly what farmland is supposed to do." Tyler crossed his arms and gave me a look. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Look, that was pure teenage smugness, despite the fact that he was 25 years old. "Sarah, be realistic. You live in an apartment in the city? You don't know anything about actually running a farm day to day. I've been coming out here my whole life." "You've been coming to Sunday dinners and complaining about the smell," I shot back. "Name one piece of equipment in that shed. Tell me what crop rotation schedule Frank used. Explain to me how the irrigation system works." Tyler's face went blank, and the silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Carol jumped in to rescue him. "He doesn't need to know those details right away," she said defensively. "He can learn or hire people to handle the technical stuff. The important thing is that he's committed to staying here and building a life on the land. I looked at Tyler, really looked at him, trying to see any sign of the commitment his mother was talking about. He was wearing pristine white sneakers that had clearly never seen a day of outdoor work, designer jeans, and a hoodie that probably cost more than most farm equipment. His hands were soft and clean, no calluses or scars from years of physical labor. He looked like what he was, a 25-year-old who'd never held a real job for more than a few months, and still lived with his parents. "Tyler," I said directly, "do you actually want to be a farmer? Or do you just want to own valuable land?" He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his mother before answering. "I want to honor Frank's legacy," he said, which wasn't really an answer at all. "Frank's legacy is sustainable agriculture and land stewardship," I replied. "His legacy is knowing every inch of this soil, understanding what it needs to stay productive for generations. His legacy is caring more about the health of the land than the value of the property." "That's a beautiful sentiment," my mother said with barely concealed impatience. "But sentiments don't pay property taxes or equipment loans. Frank may have been sentimental about this place, but we have to be practical." And there it was, the fundamental difference that Frank had understood when he wrote his will. They saw dollar signs where I saw potential. They saw a commodity to be liquidated, where I saw a legacy to be protected. They looked at 180 acres of prime farmland and calculated real estate values. I looked at the same acres and saw the future of sustainable agriculture in Iowa. "I'm not selling," I said quietly. "This farm is not for sale, and it's not up for family vote. Frank left it to me, and I'm keeping it." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Carol started talking about family loyalty and respecting your elders. My father launched into a lecture about fiscal responsibility and making smart financial decisions. Tyler muttered something about ungrateful cousins who didn't understand family priorities. But it was my mother's response that cut the deepest. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell," she said, using my full name, like I was still 8 years old. "If you think you're going to selfishly hold on to something that rightfully belongs to this entire family, you're more naive than I thought. We'll see what Frank's neighbors think when they hear how you're keeping Tyler from his inheritance." The threat was clear. If I didn't voluntarily give up the farm, they'd start a campaign to pressure me into changing my mind. In a small farming community like Millbrook County, reputation and relationships mattered almost as much as soil quality and weather patterns. They were going to try to turn my neighbors against me, to make me into the outsider who'd swooped in and stolen what belonged to the local family. I stood there in the farmyard where I'd learned to drive a tractor, surrounded by family members who were threatening to destroy my reputation if I didn't hand over my inheritance, and felt something crystallize inside me. Frank had known this would happen. He'd known they'd pressure me, threaten me, try to guilt me into giving up what he'd worked his whole life to build. And he'd left me the farm anyway, because he trusted me to be strong enough to fight for it. "You need to leave," I said calmly. "All of you. This is my property now, and you're not welcome here unless you can treat me with the respect Frank thought I deserved." The drive back to Des Moines that afternoon was a blur of anger, hurt, and determination. I'd never imagined that inheriting something I loved could feel so much like going to war. The war started 3 days later with a phone call from Jennifer Walsh, the real estate agent my mother had mentioned. Her voice was honey-sweet and professional when she introduced herself, explaining that she'd been contacted by the Mitchell family about listing Sunset Ridge Farm for immediate sale. "I understand there might be some confusion about the ownership," she said carefully, "but your family seems very motivated to move forward quickly. The market for agricultural land is extremely strong right now, and I think we could have this property sold within 60 days. I let her finish her pitch before responding. "Ms. Walsh, there's no confusion about ownership. The farm belongs to me, and it's not for sale. If my family contacted you, they were acting without authority." There was a pause, the kind that told me she'd been expecting a different conversation. "Oh," she said, clearly flustered. "I was given to understand that the inheritance was being contested, and that the family had agreed to sell and split the proceeds." "The family can agree to whatever they want," I said firmly. "But they can't sell property they don't own. Please remove this listing from any materials you've prepared." After I hung up, I sat in my Des Moines office, staring out at the city skyline, trying to process what had just happened. They weren't just pressuring me to give up the farm. They were actively trying to sell it out from under me. The audacity was breathtaking, but it also revealed how seriously they were taking this campaign to get what they wanted. That evening, I drove back to Sunset Ridge to check on the harvest progress. Miguel had started combining the corn in the North 40, and the yield looked exceptional. Golden kernels poured into the grain cart in a steady stream, the sound of successful farming that Frank had always said was better than any music. I stood at the edge of the field watching the massive combine harvester work its way through the rows, and felt a deep sense of rightness about being there. Mrs. Betty Thompson, Frank's elderly neighbor, was waiting by my car when I walked back from the field. She was a tiny woman in her 70s who'd lived on the adjacent property for over 50 years, and she'd been Frank's closest friend in the community. Her weathered hands clutched a casserole dish, and her expression was troubled. "Sarah, honey," she said, "I brought you some of that cornbread stuffing Frank always liked. Thought you might be too busy to cook with all this harvest work." I accepted the dish gratefully, touched by the gesture. "That's very kind, Mrs. Thompson. How are you holding up since Frank passed?" Her face darkened slightly. "Well, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I've been hearing some concerning things around town, and I thought you should know what people are saying." My stomach clenched. "What kind of things?" "Your cousin Tyler's been telling folks at Morrison's feed store that you're planning to sell the farm to developers. Says you don't care about preserving agricultural land because you've got city ideas about making quick money. He's got some people pretty stirred up about it." The manipulation was so calculated it took my breath away. Tyler was spreading exactly the opposite of the truth, painting me as the greedy outsider who wanted to destroy farmland for profit, when he and his family were the ones pushing for an immediate sale. "Mrs. Thompson," I said carefully, "Tyler and my family are the ones who want to sell. I'm planning to keep farming this land, just like Frank did." Her eyes brightened considerably. I was hoping that was the case. "Frank always said you had real farming sense, not like some of these young people who just see dollar signs. But Tyler's been quite convincing, telling people you don't understand the commitment it takes to work the land." I spent the next hour explaining my actual plans for the farm, my agricultural background, and my intention to continue Frank's sustainable farming practices. Mrs. Thompson listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking pointed questions about crop rotation and soil conservation. By the time I finished, she was smiling. "Frank would be proud," she said simply. "And don't you worry about the gossip. Truth has a way of coming out, especially in farming communities. People can spot a real farmer from a mile away." But Tyler's misinformation campaign was just getting started. Over the next week, I started hearing variations of his story from different sources around town. At the agricultural supply store, the clerk mentioned hearing I was planning to subdivide the property. At the gas station, an old farmer asked if it was true I'd never actually worked a harvest before. Each lie was carefully crafted to undermine my credibility and paint me as either incompetent or mercenary. The breaking point came when I received a call from the Millbrook County Agricultural Extension Office. Sandra Davis, the county agent I'd worked with on several consulting projects, sounded confused and concerned. "Sarah, I got a strange call today from someone claiming to represent the Mitchell family. They said there were questions about your qualifications to manage Sunset Ridge Farm, and they wanted to know if the extension office had any concerns about your farming practices." I felt my face flush with anger. "What did you tell them?" "I told them you were one of the most knowledgeable agricultural consultants I'd ever worked with, and that any farm would be lucky to have you managing it." "But Sarah, what's going on?" This person made it sound like there was some kind of investigation into your competency. I explained the family situation, the inheritance dispute, and Tyler's campaign of misinformation. Sandra listened with growing outrage. "That's absolutely unconscionable," she said when I finished. "Using false claims about professional competency to try to pressure someone into giving up their inheritance? Frank Mitchell was a respected member of this agricultural community, and if he left his farm to you, he had excellent reasons." Sandra's support meant more than she probably realized. In farming communities, the county agricultural agent's opinion carried significant weight, and having her publicly vouch for my qualifications would help counter Tyler's lies. But I was learning that fighting misinformation was exhausting work, requiring constant vigilance and response. The situation escalated further when my parents showed up at my Des Moines apartment unannounced on a Thursday evening. I was reviewing soil analysis reports from my consulting work when the building's security system buzzed, and my mother's voice came through the intercom asking to be let up. They looked grim and determined when I opened my door, like they'd come to deliver an ultimatum. My father was carrying a briefcase, and my mother had that tight-lipped expression she wore when she'd made up her mind about something and didn't want to hear arguments. "We need to talk," my father said without preamble, walking past me into the apartment. "This situation with the farm has gone too far." I closed the door and turned to face them, trying to prepare myself for whatever new pressure tactic they devised. "If you're here to try to convince me to sell, you're wasting your time." My mother sat down on my couch without being invited, settling in like she planned to stay a while. "Sarah, we've been trying to be patient with you, hoping you'd come to your senses about this farm situation. But you're being incredibly selfish, and it's affecting the whole family. How is keeping my inheritance affecting the family?" My father opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. "Do you have any idea what it costs to maintain a farm that size? Property taxes, equipment maintenance, insurance, seed and fertilizer costs? Frank's been struggling financially for years, and you're about to inherit a massive debt along with that land." I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. Frank was struggling financially? That's not what his books show. The farm's been profitable every year for the past decade. "You don't understand farm accounting," my mother said dismissively. "There are hidden costs, long-term equipment loans, deferred maintenance issues. Tyler's been helping Frank with the paperwork for months, and he knows the real financial situation." Something cold settled in my stomach. Tyler had been helping with Frank's paperwork? Frank, who'd been managing farm finances successfully for 40 years, suddenly needed help from someone who'd never held a real job. The timeline didn't make sense, and neither did Frank's supposed financial struggles. "I want to see the documents Tyler's been working on," I said. My father hesitated, glancing at my mother before responding. "That's family financial information." Tyler was helping Frank organize things for estate planning purposes. Estate planning that somehow didn't include the person who actually inherited the estate? I shot back. "Let me see the paperwork or get out of my apartment." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. My parents exchanged a look that told me they'd expected this conversation to go very differently. They'd come here thinking they could convince me I was inheriting problems instead of assets, that I'd be grateful to let them sell the farm and save me from financial ruin. "Sarah," my mother said, her voice taking on a pleading tone, "you're being stubborn about something you don't understand. Tyler's been preparing to take over the farm for months. He's invested time and energy into learning Frank's systems. You can't just sweep in and undo all that work." "What systems has he learned?" I asked. Because when I was there last week, he couldn't even tell me what crops Frank plants in rotation. "He's been focusing on the business side," my father said defensively. "Marketing, financial planning, operational efficiency. The kind of big picture thinking that actually matters for farm profitability." I almost laughed. Tyler, who'd never managed anything more complex than a video game tournament, was supposedly doing business planning for a multi-million-dollar agricultural operation. The story kept getting more ridiculous, but my parents seemed genuinely convinced that Tyler was some kind of farming prodigy who'd suddenly discovered his calling. "Show me his business plan," I said. "If Tyler's been doing all this analysis and planning, he should have documentation." Another uncomfortable silence. My mother fidgeted with her purse strap, and my father shuffled through his briefcase like he was looking for something that wasn't there. "The plan is still in development," my mother finally said. Tyler wanted to wait until after the inheritance was settled before finalizing everything. "Convenient," I said dryly. "So Tyler's master plan for the farm exists only in his head, but I'm supposed to hand over my inheritance based on his potential business genius." My father's patience finally snapped. "Damn it, Sarah, this isn't about Tyler's qualifications or business plans. This is about family loyalty and doing what's right for everyone involved. Frank made a mistake leaving the farm to you, and we're trying to fix it before you get hurt financially." "Frank didn't make a mistake," I said quietly. "He made a choice. He chose the person who actually understood farming over the person who thought they deserved to inherit it." I walked to my apartment door and opened it, making my intentions clear. "I think we're done here. The farm is mine, it's staying mine, and I'm not interested in any more family meetings about it." They left without another word, but the look my mother gave me as she walked past was pure venom. I'd crossed a line by refusing to pretend their arguments made sense, and they weren't going to forgive me for choosing Frank's vision over their financial planning. The next phase of their campaign started the following Monday with a call from James Patterson, Frank's lawyer. His voice was carefully neutral when he explained that he'd received a request from Robert Mitchell to review the estate planning documents for potential irregularities. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I knew where this was going. "Your father seems to believe that Frank may not have been competent when he signed the will, or that he was under undue influence from someone who stood to benefit from the inheritance." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. They were suggesting that I'd somehow manipulated Frank into leaving me the farm, that his decision wasn't legitimate because he'd been influenced by his money-grabbing niece. The idea was so offensive I could barely speak. "Mr. Patterson," I said when I finally found my voice, "you were there when Frank signed the will. Was he competent?" "Absolutely," Patterson replied firmly. "Your uncle was sharp as ever. Asked detailed questions about the legal language, and made it very clear that he'd thought long and hard about his decision. I've handled hundreds of estate planning cases, and I've never seen someone more certain about their intentions." "And was I even present when he signed it?" "No, you weren't. Frank came to my office alone, with no family members present. He specifically said he wanted to handle the matter privately to avoid family pressure. This was entirely his decision, made independently." Patterson went on to explain that my father's challenge had no legal merit, but that it could potentially tie up the estate in probate court for months or even years. Even frivolous challenges could create complications, especially if they could find a doctor willing to question Frank's mental state retroactively. "They're trying to force me into a settlement," I realized. "Create enough legal complications that I'll agree to sell and split the money just to avoid the hassle." "That would be my assessment," Patterson agreed. "It's a common tactic in inheritance disputes. Create uncertainty and expense until the rightful heir decides it's easier to compromise." But I wasn't interested in compromising, especially not when the compromise meant destroying everything Frank had worked to build. I authorized Patterson to fight any legal challenges aggressively, and prepared myself for what was clearly going to be a long battle. The war intensified over the following weeks as harvest season reached its peak. I'd taken a leave of absence from my consulting job to focus on the farm full-time, working alongside Miguel to bring in the corn and soybeans before the weather turned. The work was physically demanding but deeply satisfying, confirming everything I'd felt about wanting to farm full-time. Tyler showed up during the second week of harvest, bringing a camera crew from the local television station. He'd apparently convinced them to do a story about a farming family torn apart by inheritance disputes, positioning himself as the heartbroken nephew who'd been cheated out of his birthright by a greedy cousin. I was in the machine shed, adjusting the combine header when I heard voices in the farmyard. Through the open door, I could see Tyler gesturing dramatically toward the fields while a reporter with a microphone nodded sympathetically. The camera operator was getting establishing shots of the farmhouse and barn, clearly setting up for an emotional piece about family dysfunction. Miguel appeared at my elbow, his face grim. "That boy's telling them you're planning to sell to developers, that you're going to destroy the farmland for housing subdivisions. Says his grandfather would be rolling in his grave if he knew what was happening to the family farm." Frank hadn't been Tyler's grandfather. He'd been his great-uncle. But Tyler was apparently rewriting family relationships along with family history, whatever served his narrative better. I watched him point toward the cornfields with theatrical sadness, probably explaining how his deep connection to the land was being destroyed by my urban greed. "Should I go talk to them?" I asked Miguel. He shook his head. "Let him dig his own hole. Anyone who knows farming can see those fields have been managed by someone who cares about the land. The corn's healthy, the soil's in good condition, and the equipment's well maintained. People aren't stupid, Miss Sarah. they can tell the difference between someone who talks about farming and someone who actually does it. Miguel was right, but Tyler's media campaign still stung. That evening, the local news ran a segment titled, "Family Farm in Dispute," that painted the situation as a tragic story of inheritance gone wrong. Tyler came across as earnest and heartbroken, talking about his dreams of continuing the family tradition, while I remained the mysterious city cousin who'd refused to comment. The story mentioned that I'd inherited the farm despite having, quote, limited farming experience, a characterization that made my agricultural science degree and 5 years of consulting work disappear entirely. They interviewed Mrs. Walsh, the real estate agent, who expressed concern about the future of the property under, quote, uncertain management. They even found a random farmer at the coffee shop who said something about young people not understanding the commitment farming required. What they didn't mention was Tyler's complete lack of agricultural experience, his history of job hopping, or the fact that my family was the one pushing for an immediate sale to developers. The story wasn't technically false, but it was so slanted that it might as well have been fiction. The media attention brought new pressures. I started getting calls from land developers who'd seen the news story and wanted to make offers on the property. Real estate investors left messages explaining how they could help me maximize the value of my inheritance. One particularly persistent caller claimed to represent a company that specialized in converting agricultural land to residential developments, promising premium prices for quick sales. Each call was like a knife twist, confirmation that Tyler's lies were reaching exactly the audience he'd intended. He'd painted me as someone who wanted to destroy farmland for profit, and now actual developers were calling to help me do exactly that. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. But Tyler had made one crucial mistake in his media strategy. By claiming that Frank would be rolling in his grave over my inheritance, he'd challenged Frank's judgment and competency in a very public way. And Frank Mitchell had been a respected member of the Millbrook County farming community for over 40 years. The backlash started with a letter to the editor of the local newspaper from Sandra Davis, the county agricultural agent. She wrote a scathing response to the news coverage, pointing out that I was, quote, one of the most qualified agricultural professionals in the region, and that Frank had been fully competent and deliberate in his estate planning decisions. Franklin Mitchell was nobody's fool, she wrote. If he chose Sarah Mitchell to inherit his farm, it was because he recognized her commitment to sustainable agriculture and her deep understanding of modern farming practices. The suggestion that this decision was somehow misguided is an insult to Frank's memory and his 40 years of successful farming. Mrs. Thompson followed with her own letter, describing Tyler's, quote, complete lack of interest in farming during his visits to the area, and praising my, quote, genuine enthusiasm for agricultural work that she'd observed since childhood. She pointed out that I'd been, quote, learning Frank's methods for 20 years, while Tyler had been playing video games in town. The letters kept coming. Miguel wrote about working with both Tyler and me over the years, noting that I was the only family member who ever asked intelligent questions about farming, while Tyler, quote, couldn't tell a combine from a corn planter. The equipment dealer where Frank bought his machinery wrote about my technical knowledge of agricultural equipment. The veterinarian who treated Frank's livestock mentioned my obvious expertise in animal husbandry compared to Tyler's visible discomfort around farm animals. Within a week, Tyler's narrative had completely collapsed. The farming community had rallied around Frank's decision and my qualifications, making it clear that anyone who actually knew agriculture could see which Mitchell family member belonged on the farm. Tyler went from local media darling to community laughingstock, his lack of farming knowledge exposed by people who'd watched him avoid farm work for years. The final blow came when the local newspaper decided to do a follow-up story about the inheritance dispute. This time they interviewed people who actually knew Frank and had worked with both Tyler and me over the years. The resulting article, titled, quote, Community Supports Farmer's Final Wishes, demolished every lie Tyler had told about the situation. Tyler tried one last desperate gambit, showing up at the farm during harvest with a lawyer he'd apparently hired to contest the will. I was running the grain cart, transferring corn from the combine to the waiting truck, when I saw them pull into the farmyard. Tyler looked nervous and defeated, while his lawyer appeared skeptical about whatever case he'd been asked to pursue. Miguel and I finished the grain transfer before walking over to meet them. The lawyer, a young man in an expensive suit who clearly wasn't used to farm environments, was trying to avoid stepping in anything, while Tyler gestured ineffectively at the harvest operation. "Ms. Mitchell," the lawyer said, extending a hand I didn't shake. "I'm David Chen, representing Mr. Tyler Mitchell in this inheritance matter. We're here to inform you that we're proceeding with a formal challenge to Frank Mitchell's will based on questions about his mental competency." I looked at Tyler, who couldn't meet my eyes. "You're really going to claim that Frank wasn't competent when he wrote his will?" "Frank was confused about a lot of things toward the end," Tyler mumbled. "The medication he was taking, the stress of managing the farm alone. He wasn't thinking clearly about what was best for the family." "What medication?" I asked. "Frank wasn't taking any medication that affects cognitive function. I have his medical records." Tyler's face went pale. His lawyer stepped closer, suddenly interested in this detail. "What medical records?" "Frank's doctor provided them as part of the estate documentation," I explained. "Frank had slightly elevated cholesterol and took a low-dose statin. No cardiac medications, no psychological medications, nothing that would affect his decision-making ability. His last cognitive assessment was completely normal." I watched Tyler's lawyer process this information, his expression shifting from confident to concerned. Tyler had apparently neglected to mention that his claims about Frank's mental state were completely fictional. "Mr. Mitchell," the lawyer said carefully, "when we discussed your uncle's medical condition, you indicated there were documented cognitive issues." Tyler started backtracking immediately. "I meant he seemed confused sometimes. Not that there were official medical problems. Just, he wasn't thinking about what was fair to the family." The lawyer's expression went from concerned to irritated. He'd clearly realized that Tyler had misrepresented the strength of his case, probably omitting crucial details about his own lack of farming experience and the family's desire to sell the property. "Ms. Mitchell," the lawyer said, "I apologize for this intrusion. Based on new information, I don't believe my client has grounds for a competency challenge." Tyler's face crumpled. "But you said we could fight this. You said there were ways to contest inheritance decisions." "Based on legitimate legal grounds," the lawyer replied sharply. "Not based on unsupported claims about mental incompetency. I'm withdrawing from this case." He walked back to his car, leaving Tyler standing alone in the farmyard, looking lost and defeated. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. He'd convinced himself that he deserved the farm, that Frank's decision was somehow illegitimate, and that he could lie his way into an inheritance he'd never earned. "Tyler," I said quietly, "it's over. The farm is mine, legally and rightfully. Frank knew exactly what he was doing when he left it to me." He looked around the farmyard, taking in the harvest operation, the well-maintained equipment, the obvious signs of successful farming. For the first time, he seemed to really see what he'd been fighting to claim. "I don't even know how to run a combine," he admitted finally. "I know," I said. "Frank knew that too." Tyler left without another word, driving slowly down the gravel road like he was seeing the farm clearly for the first time. I watched his car disappear around the bend, then turned back to the harvest that needed finishing. The legal challenges ended that day. Within a week, my parents and Aunt Carol had stopped calling, stopped demanding family meetings, stopped trying to orchestrate my surrender of the inheritance. They'd exhausted their arguments, their pressure tactics, and their public relations campaign. Frank's will was upheld, the community supported my ownership of the farm, and Tyler had publicly embarrassed himself trying to claim qualifications he didn't possess. 6 months later, I was living full-time at Sunset Ridge Farm, having resigned from my consulting job to focus entirely on agricultural work. The farmhouse needed updating, but it felt like home in a way my Des Moines apartment never had. I'd hired 2 additional seasonal workers to help Miguel with the expanded operation, and we were already planning crop rotations for the following year. The farm was more profitable than it had ever been under Frank's management, not because I was a better farmer, but because I had access to modern agricultural technology and marketing strategies that Frank had been slow to adopt. Precision farming techniques, advanced soil testing, and direct marketing to local restaurants and farmers markets had increased both yield and profit margins significantly. My family had largely written me off, which was painful but ultimately liberating. Christmas dinner was awkward, Easter was worse, and eventually I stopped attending family gatherings altogether. Tyler had moved to Illinois, supposedly to take a job in agricultural sales, though I suspected he was just tired of being known locally as the guy who tried to steal his great-uncle's farm. Mrs. Thompson became my closest neighbor and friend, often stopping by with vegetables from her garden or advice about local agricultural politics. She'd been right about truth coming out in farming communities. Everyone in Millbrook County knew the real story of Frank's inheritance decision, and they respected both his choice and my commitment to honoring it. Standing in the same cornfield where Frank had taught me to judge crop maturity by touch, watching the sunset paint the prairie sky in shades of gold and crimson, I felt the deep satisfaction of work that mattered. This wasn't just about owning land or making money. This was about stewardship, sustainability, and carrying forward the agricultural knowledge Frank had spent a lifetime accumulating. Frank had been right to trust me with his legacy. The farm was thriving, the land was healthy, and the community had embraced me as a legitimate successor to his agricultural expertise. Tyler could have had all of this if he'd ever shown genuine interest in farming, instead of just assuming he deserved to inherit it. But Frank had seen through the entitlement to the truth underneath, and he'd made his choice accordingly. Sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory is to refuse to let other people rewrite their story. Frank knew exactly who belonged on his farm, and he'd been right all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.